Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with some winter book recommendations. I am somewhat of a seasonal reader. When the seasons change, I always find that there are certain types of books that I am really interested in picking up in certain seasons. And so today I thought I would recommend a few of my favorites to read during the winter months. I sometimes think winter is actually my favorite season, though I tend to say fall, but here in North Carolina, fall kind of morphs into winter. There reaches a point where it kind of drops from 70 degrees to 40, and I don't necessarily feel as though all the time that North Carolina really gets an autumn season. I think we just jump from one extreme to the next. But I really love cold mornings. I love dark evenings. This is just a really great time of year, and I think it's a really great time of year for reading. So I think I have things separated out here into a few different categories, actually. So to start with, I say we start with the classics. Of course, I think at this time of year, everyone is thinking about Christmas. Now, I am not actually a Christmas reader. There are not books that I tend to really read around Christmas, except in a couple of cases. I'm not someone who finds a Christmas setting in books all that fascinating. I really love Christmas films though, which is kind of odd, but I'm not a big Christmas reader. So I think there are a couple of big ones to talk about here though. Of course, there is A Christmas Carol, which I'm sure everyone knows. And I think in general, Charles Dickens fits very well in the wintertime. But the book that I want to recommend that has to do with Christmas was one of my favorite discoveries of last year, and that is The Nutcracker by Alexandre Dumas. Now, The Nutcracker is a story that is now famous for being a ballet, but it was originally written in German by a man named E.T.A. Hoffmann, and I have not yet read his version of the tale, but I found out last year that Alexandre Dumas had his own telling of it, and so I ordered a copy and I read it on Christmas Eve, and it was just a really wonderful, magical experience. The Nutcracker is probably my favorite Christmas story. I love the Nutcracker ballet. I love the Barbie Nutcracker specifically. I adore the Barbie Nutcracker movie, but I really love the ballet, and I would love to see it put on by a really famous ballet company one day. But if you are at all familiar with Alexandre Dumas, then I think you know this is a really charmingly told story. And it's very short. This is the vintage edition, I think. Here's what the text kind of looks like. It is so cute. The cover is so lovely. And I have the sense that even if I had read the E.T.A. Hoffmann version, I would likely prefer Alexandre Dumas. So this is a really high recommend for me if you were looking for something to read during the Christmas season. I really wanted to put a Russian classic on this list because I feel as though 2021 has been in a weird way defined by the Russians for me. I have attempted to read and have read a lot of Russian classics this year, but actually the majority of the Russian classics I read feel very spring and summer to me. So I really struggled here because I did think a Russian classic deserved to be on this list. They tend to be really long and lushly written, and I think that works very well in the winter because you kind of want a nice long book to keep you company on those long winter nights. But I settled actually on poetry. So the book that I really want to recommend is Yevgeny Onegin, which is by Alexander Pushkin. But I have here the complete prose of Alexander Pushkin, which I would also recommend. So for the most part, Pushkin wrote in poetry and also in short stories. And I think short stories work really well in the wintertime. They feel very fairy tale-like. And that is something that I'm really attracted to at this time of year. If you're looking for a specific recommendation, I really loved The Moor of Peter the Great, and I absolutely adore The Queen of Spades. The Queen of Spades is 5 stars, and so in a way is Yevgeny Onegin. That is his longer kind of epic poem, a novel in verse, if you will, and I really fell in love with that earlier this year. I think I only rated it 4 stars at the time, but as time has gone on, I have really continued to think of it, and so I kind of want to move it up and give it 5 stars. But this is another recommendation. I think the Russians work really well this time of year, but some people, weirdly enough, fit more for me in the spring summer realm. I think Ivan Turgenev, he's very spring to me. Now, I've not read Fathers and Sons yet, and I may change my opinion, but right now for me, he sits very, very spring summery. On the theme of fairy tales, one of my favorite fairy tale writers is, of course, Hans Christian Andersen. Hans Christian Andersen is Danish, and so that's largely why I have a great affection for him. But he actually wrote several of my favorite fairy tales of all time. My actual favorite fairy tale, and this is kind of controversial, I think, to pick something by Hans Christian Andersen and not something that was Charles Perrault or Brothers Grimm, but I love a fairy tale called The Tinderbox. It is just so great. That's really my highest recommendation from his collection of fairy tales. I love The Tinderbox, but there are a couple of his fairy tales that work really, really well in the Christmas season. I will warn you though, Hans Christian Andersen is very sad. His fairy tales are very melancholy, and there's often just a really depressing tone to some of them, which I do think kind of goes hand in hand with winter. Winter for me is generally a very happy, uplifting season because I just really like the cold, but some people really don't like the cold and they don't really like the dark. So maybe if you're one of those people, don't read Hans Christian Andersen because he's not really going to uplift you. A lot of his stories are really, really sad. Another of my favorite fairy tales is Thumbelina, which he wrote. I adore Thumbelina so much. Thumbelina, maybe that's in my top 5 fairy tales. I love Thumbelina. The Steadfast Tin Soldier is one you should read at Christmas. It's really, really sad, and I think I only associate it with Christmas because it has to do with toys, but read it. Read it this Christmas. We, of course, have the Snow Queen and the Red Shoes. The Red Shoes is heartbreaking, but The Little Match Girl is one that I want to recommend you read here in the Christmas season. You will cry reading The Little Match Girl. And when I was growing up, I had like a big picture book version of The Little Match Girl, and it was something that I read every Christmas, which sounds kind of morbid when you know the story of The Little Match Girl, but I've always found that story very moving and a very important story to read at Christmas, actually. So that's one that I would also recommend. I think this is the last of the true classics. So the last classic that I want to recommend is one of my all-time favorites, and that is Frankenstein. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley is very frozen. It takes place partially kind of in the mountains. There are a couple of really big scenes set on the ice. It's just a really great book to read in the winter, and I think it's also very introspective. It causes you to think quite a bit, which I also really like in the winter. I like a book that I can really sink my teeth into from all aspects. I think this is a really, really great one to read in the winter. Kind of building off the fairy tale aspect, I have a few other kind of short story collections that I would like to recommend. One of them is The Last Wish by Andrej Sapkowski, and this is the first book in the Witcher series. Truly, you do not have to continue on after you have read this book. In fact, I almost suggest that you don't do it. I really think that the series really drags. Like when you get into the actual novels and not the short story collections, I truly believe the series is not as strong as I would like it to be. But the first 2 books in this series are fairy tale retellings, and they are very episodic. And so this series follows a character that is called a Witcher, and he is essentially a monster that hunts other monsters. It's really interesting because a lot of these fairy tale retellings completely turn the tales on their heads, which I really appreciate and I think is really the value of a retelling. I wanted to recommend just the Grisha trilogy in general, but I decided to hone in on a particular book from the Grisha verse. And so this is The Language of Thorns, which is a fairy tale collection. And so in universe, in the world of the Grisha, this is essentially the book that parents read to their children from. And so these tales bear some resemblance to fairy tales that we are really familiar with, but in some cases they are incredibly new. But one of my favorite pieces of literature of all time is in this collection. I love the Grisha trilogy and the Grisha verse in general, as you all probably know, but I really think her strongest writing might actually be in this collection, and that is in a kind of retelling of the Nutcracker, which is just genuinely incredible. It's really dark, it's really romantic, which I think the Nutcracker should be. If you enjoy short stories, I think this is a really great one, and if you enjoy fairy tales in particular, this is one that I would highly recommend. You also don't really need to have read anything else in the Grishaverse to pick this up, which is really why I wanted to recommend it. Last but not least, in the short story compilations, I really wanted to recommend something Viking related. For me, winter is a very Viking oriented season. It's so strange because the Vikings actually went a Viking in the summer. It's not something they did in the winter. In the winter, they stayed home. But there's something about the winter that really feels Viking to me. I think I always get into Viking media this time of year. I always feel the pull to picking something up. And so something that I wanted to recommend that I think fits really well in the winter that is not straightforwardly Viking is Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology. I really love to read mythology this time of year. I love to read fantasy, and this scratches also the Viking itch for me because this, of course, was their religion. If you have not read this, boy, you were in for a treat. I could have recommended any number of Neil Gaiman books here because I do just think his style and his way of writing works really well in the winter seasons. He's so magical, but people either love or hate Neil Gaiman. If you have never tried him before, I think Norse mythology is a great place to start. This is, of course, his retelling of the Norse myths, but it is done in Neil Gaiman's kind of typical style. So if you know you don't like him, maybe this one isn't for you. But I do think the Vikings and Norse myth just fit really well at this time of year. Next is my only more literary fiction or thriller of the bunch, and that is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. I recommend this for a specific reason because there is a scene that happens in this book that really feels viscerally winter to me. Actually, a large majority of the book takes place in the colder months of the year, but there is one scene, and if you've read it, I think you know what I'm talking about, that just felt so cold. I felt cold reading it, which I think makes this a really spectacular read for the wintertime. It's also a book that if you haven't read it before, I think you are going to be compelled to keep picking it up. In the winter, I am far more willing to pick up a longer book or a denser book because I just really enjoy reading in winter more than I do some other seasons. And so I think this is a really good one for that. It's a fairly long book. There is an underlying, not necessarily a mystery, because you as the reader know exactly what happens from the very beginning. But I will say there is kind of an underlying dread. And I think that really makes it a very compelling read. Next is a category that I know does not apply to everybody, but this is something very personal to me. I always find as I get into December and January that I'm really compelled to watch a lot of classic films. This always starts for me when I start rewatching White Christmas, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. It's certainly my favorite Christmas movie, but I watch White Christmas year round. But something even more compelling to me than the actual films is often the Hollywood stars' secret lives. And so I always like to pick up a classic Hollywood biography this time of year. So one that I would like to recommend is Possessed: The Life of Joan Crawford by Donald Spoto. This is one of the best classic Hollywood biographies that I have ever read. It's largely good because Joan Crawford is a very interesting figure, and she is somebody who I think if you are just kind of getting into classic Hollywood and you want an in, you want to follow a person in to kind of get context for the different eras and the different decades, Joan Crawford is a really good one. She started out as a silent film star, and she worked till the very end of her life. And so she saw the rise and fall of a lot of classic Hollywood. She had a really famous feud with Bette Davis, which is really fun and exciting to read about. And how true it was, how staged it was, is always up for debate. But this is one of my favorites, and I think it's a really good way to get into classic film and classic film stars if you haven't before, because I just find Joan Crawford really fascinating. One that's up for me this year is this biography of Dean Martin. I'm so excited about this. This is kind of inspired by my favorite podcast, which is You Must Remember This. It's all about classic Hollywood, and I will link to it down below, but she's currently doing a season right now on Sammy Davis Jr. and Dean Martin, and I love Dean Martin. I also love Sammy Davis Jr. I just really love the Rat Pack. So this is one that I'm really excited about. I was debating a couple of weeks ago making my classic Hollywood biography of the year being one about Frank Sinatra, because I've actually never read a biography of him, and I think that would also be really fun. So maybe I should just make my way through the Rat Pack. But I'm excited to read about Dean Martin. Dean Martin is one of my favorite musical artists. I can't say that I've seen him in very much. I can't judge him too much as an actor, so he's one that I definitely should explore watching this winter. Last but not least is fantasy, but it's most specifically Arthurian fantasy. I'm not sure why that's what appeals to me in the winter, but it does, and I think it fits really well in the winter. There's something mythological about it. There's also something very cold and cozy about it as well to me. So I just find myself really compelled to pick up Arthurian legends at this time of year. So really in the end, this became more of a personal list. This is personally what I like reading in the winter. So I think it just depends for me when I pick things up. That's when I start to associate them with a certain season. The first of these is actually not an Arthurian retelling. It is a retelling of Beowulf. And so this is the Boneless Mercies by Genevieve Tucholke. This was one of my favorite books of 2019. I think it was the last book I read in 2019, and I declared it my favorite. So this was just such a fun read, and it's so impactful. It's so beautifully written. I will say this won't work for everyone because it follows the beats of Beowulf very interestingly. And Beowulf, if you haven't read it, has a lot of wandering in it. There are kind of episodes in the epic poem where people come into contact with characters where they wind up being utterly meaningless by the end, and really that interaction was meaningless to the plot. And she keeps that in here, and I think that's very irritating to the modern reader. But to me, the language of it is just so beautiful. The setting here is incredible. The Boneless Mercies are actually a group of women who go around mercy killing. It's so dreamy, just this fantasy world I want to live in forever. And I'm so glad that she decided to continue writing in it because her companion novel to the Boneless Mercies is an Arthurian retelling, and that is Seven Endless Forests. This was also 5 stars and was also genuinely incredible. I'm due for a reread of these. This is a very light Arthurian retelling. I think you can see the Arthurian elements in it very clearly. If you are familiar with King Arthur, there is kind of a sword in a tree rather than a sword and a stone, and that's the most blatant reference. But there are other more subtle things going on in this book that I think are just a feast if you really enjoy King Arthur. So this is another that I would highly recommend. I do think these books will be hit or miss for people, but they're just so beautifully written, and they're just the perfect books to read wrapped up in a blanket with a cup of tea. My dream is that she writes another in this world, and it is a retelling of Robin Hood. That is what I'm waiting for. I would also recommend Lancelot by Giles Kristian, and this is a really wonderful Arthurian legend retelling from the perspective of Lancelot, who is my favorite in the Arthurian legend, actually. He is my favorite knight. And this is a more realistic retelling. This is something that's kind of set in our real world. There are only a couple of mystical elements to it, fantastical elements to it, which I think makes this stray a little bit more into historical fiction than truly fantasy. And I really love that. Those are the kind of Arthurian legend retellings that I think I find most compelling, really. And so this is really just a character study of Lancelot. It is genuinely a beautiful, moving book. And if I'm remembering correctly, a lot of this takes place also during the winter. And so it's just a really great one to read. He has a companion novel that I think is about Galahad. And so I'm interested in picking that up. But this was so dreamy. This is one of my favorite Arthurian legend retellings of all time. Last of the Arthurian legend retellings is potentially in my top 5 favorites of the year, and that is Half Sick of Shadows by Laura Sebastian. This book is incredible. This is an Arthurian legend retelling from the perspective of the Lady of Shalott. And so it is so interestingly written. The Lady of Shalott can kind of tell the future. So the book is written in 3 different tenses. It's written in past tense when she's kind of reflecting on events that happened maybe in her childhood. It's written in present tense for what is happening currently. And then she has kind of a more future tense when she is having a vision of what might happen. This book is so dreamy. It is so perfect. It's probably right now my favorite Arthurian legend retelling because I think it got it. It got that the tone of most Arthurian legends is kind of melancholy. And so you, along with the main character, you know where things are heading. And if you're familiar with the Arthurian legend, you know that when you go into any Arthurian legend retelling. And so the book plays with that in an interesting way. It assumes you know quite a bit about how this will unfold. I really appreciate what this book was trying to do, and I think truly it is one of the most beautifully written books of the year for me. And a scene from this book lives rent-free in my brain. That scene shows a lot of what I think is endemic in scenes and in books that I tend to love, is this really wonderful character moment and a sense of dread, a sense of melancholy. This is just a really, really beautiful book, and I highly recommend it. Last but not least, I wanted to recommend a great historical fiction series. I used to talk about this series quite a bit when I first started my channel, and it deserves more airplay on my channel. It's one of my all-time favorites. And this is a series that starts with The Iron King. It's by an author named Maurice Joan. And so this also could have gone under my classics section because this was written in the 1950s. And it is a French series, so it has been translated into English. Thankfully now, all 7 books, I believe, have been translated into English. At one time when I was reading them, the last 2 had not been released yet. But this is the series that supposedly inspired George R.R. Martin to write A Game of Thrones. And so this is a historical fiction series set in the early 1300s in France. And so it is following the reign in this first book of Philippe le Bel, Philip IV of France, and it starts with kind of the dissolution of the Templars. And this is just a really compelling time period in history. There are a lot of big players and big names, and everyone is interesting. Everything about this series is absolutely crazy, and you'll find yourself Googling while reading, did this actually happen or did he make this up? Some of the craziest things you read is the stuff that actually happened, and you find out that he changed very little. This is just incredible historical fiction. This is what I think historical fiction should be. After Bernard Cornwell's Last Kingdom series, this is my favorite historical fiction series, and it is one that I think fits very perfectly in the winter season. There are a bunch of books in it, and so if you get really hooked, you can just dive in and read the entire series, and trust me, you will get hooked. I could have mentioned so many more books here, but these are just a few of my favorites. And I think really it has shown me that what I read in the wintertime is not necessarily books that are set in winter, but books that I just kind of now associate with the season. Maybe the first time I picked up a book, I read it in the winter, and so now that entire genre is associated with winter for me, such as in the case of classic films. I'm not really sure why I associate them with the winter. I would love to know if you have read any of these down below, and I would love to know what you tend to like to read in the winter. Do you have any winter recommendations? But that's going to be all from me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.